Come on in, pull up a chair and take a load off because today I'll be sharing my review as well as a bit of a page through for the Old School Reference and Index Companion from the First Edition Society. Is OSRIC a fantastic way for you to replicate Advanced Dungeons and Dragons adventures today? Or are the mechanics behind AD&D really creaky and cranky and best left behind in the dustbin of history? Well, you're going to find out right after this. Howdy, 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 gang. Welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host here at the Gaming Gang channel. As mentioned in the open, I am going to be reviewing the Old School Reference and Index Companion, and that's going to be the last time I'm going to refer to it that way because OSRIC just rolls off the tongue way easier. So before I jump in, I do want to mention, if you're not familiar with the Gaming Gang or with myself personally, I've been running role-playing games for over 40 years. And I remember good old AD&D. I had all the books. In fact, you can see I've got the Player's Handbook as well as the Dungeon Master's Guide behind me. And of course, in the interest of being fully transparent, those are not my original game books by any stretch. But I am very, very familiar with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, or as some folks would refer to it, First Edition Dungeons and Dragons. I always call it AD&D because that's what it was for me. In fact, even the second edition, I would still call second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Third edition, not so much. I just call it third edition D&D or 3E D&D. And because to me, the mechanics behind the game, the core mechanics, had changed radically. I mean, you're still rolling a D20 for a lot of stuff, but there was quite a bit of a change. So to me, it's no longer really Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And of course, by that point in time, there was no basic or expert Dungeons and Dragons on the market anymore anyway. All right, with that out of the way, we are going to dive in. And I am going to be taking a look at and reviewing OSRIC, which is from First Edition Society. It's authored and edited by Matt Finch, Stuart Marshall, Chris Hopkins, James Boney, Trent Foster, David M. Prada, Robert Ross, Jeremy Gehring, Mike Davison, Daniel Proctor, B. Scott Hoover, Chris Kane, Bill Sylvie, Floyd Kennedy, Vincent Fruget. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing some of these names. Matthew James Stanham, John Adams, Fabrice Philibert Calat, Nick Bogan, Mark Evans, and Matthew Stewart. Artwork is provided by Matt Finch, John Bingham, Peter Mullen, James Wesley Blair, Jason Braun, Fabrice Philibert Calat, Andy Adam Taylor, Sean Stone, and Mark Ahmed. The 279-page hardcover is available as a print on demand from lulu.com for right now $25.20. Do want to point out the PDF is absolutely free through Lulu as well. So if you're kind of curious, you want to dip your toes in, by all means, you can get yourself the PDF absolutely free. So let's swing on over to the other camera. And I apologize. It's awfully dry down here in the Duct Tape Studios today. So let me grab a quick sip. All right. So let's dive in. So I already have done a page through video. So I didn't share every single page of this either. But I'm going to kind of jump through this a bit quicker. I'm not necessarily going to look at every single page here. So one thing I will mention as far as OSRIC is I don't consider this really a retro clone. And the reason behind that is normally with most old school Renaissance role playing games, a retro clone makes some sort of changes, some changes to the mechanics. Maybe they streamline some stuff. Maybe they take some of the clunky aspects of it and they toss it out, replace it with something else. Or a lot of times they just kind of replace more modern mechanics into that system and still have an old school feel to the game, but a little more modern as far as the execution of the mechanics. That is not the case here. Essentially, this is first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in one volume, as opposed to being a player's handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and Monster Manual. All that information is in here. Now, of course, they never mentioned Dungeons and Dragons. I can mention Dungeons and Dragons. I am not selling this, right? I don't have to worry about copyright. I'm just discussing the game book and where you have to come at it from. So some of the clunkiness of first edition Dungeons and Dragons, I'm just going to say AD&D, because to me, saying first edition Dungeons and Dragons is just really unnatural for me. Anyway, it does have some of the head scratchers from that system itself. So, of course, if you're not familiar with AD&D, you've got your attributes. You're rolling your 3 6-sided dice, so you're going to have 3 to 18. And, of course, higher is better. So one of the things that is still in this, and once again, I have to stress, you're really not seeing any mechanical changes here. The presentation is different. The way that things are put together is different. In fact, much better than in those 3 core books from back in the day. A bit more intuitive. But these mechanics are still very similar. So I'll give you an example. You get to, like, for an example, you've got like dexterity, wisdom. If you've got a score of, 8 to 14 or 7 to 14? I forget. Let me take a quick peek back here. For wisdom and dexterity, it really doesn't do anything. Strength, there's some changes. Where is it? Here we go. Yeah, so you get absolutely no bonus up to 15. So it's it's 16 or higher that you're seeing a bonus. And from 6 to 15 really doesn't do anything. There's no armor class adjustment. There's no surprise bonus. There's no missile bonus to hit. And it runs the same way with wisdom as well. From 8 to 14, there's really nothing different, which is kind of strange. Something else I do want to point out is that there are still the odd applications of percentile in OSRIC because it was in AD&D. So as an example, the core resolution die is usually a D20. Well, in some cases, you're going to roll percentile dice. So for thieves and some specific acts of strength, which might seem kind of odd to people. And one way that I kind of sum it up is if you're familiar with Call of Cthulhu, which is from Chaosium Inc., it is a percentile dice based mechanic for resolution. So everything you're rolling, percentile dice. Granted, yes, you'll use polyhedrons for damage and things like that, but you're still utilizing the percentile dice. So it'd be very strange where all of a sudden you're always using percentile dice, and then suddenly when you go to investigate something at a library, now you're rolling a D20 to resolve that action. That's what I mean by it kind of throws some people off a little bit. The wonkiness of the descending armor class is still here as well. So that's something to keep in mind. The descending armor class is not as intuitive as an ascending armor class for people to figure out. especially game masters, on the fly. Something I found kind of interesting here is looking at the weapons is in AD&D. Gary Gygax just had this odd pole arms fetish. So he's got all these different pole arms, and they're all a little bit different. They do a little bit different damage and things like that. And of course, nobody knew what these things were back in the day, and we didn't have the internet to look things up. Here, it's a halberd and pole arms. That's it. So I thought that was kind of funny. You do have the different races. You've also got the different classes. So you've still got your paladins, your illusionist, your assassin. So as opposed to like in basic and expert Dungeons and Dragons, and even original Dungeons and Dragons, we'll throw out the thief. You had the fighter, the wizard, and the cleric. And then, of course, the thief came along. And that was in basic. Now, of course, here you have far more options. Something I do like about OSRIC a lot is the spell section. I like spells that are, 1 or 2 paragraphs, tells me everything I need to know. We've got a little kind of stat block section here. That's great. I love that. So we do have the spells broken down by class as well as level. And then when we actually get into the spells, they are alphabetical. So one aspect of more modern fantasy role-playing games that I am not a huge fan of is the just page-long descriptions of some spells and things like that. And it's sort of like, so the game master is supposed to kind of keep that in mind. And yes, I know a lot of people, including myself, require the player characters to understand the ins and outs of the abilities of their characters, including spells. But do you really need like an entire page or an entire column with all that information? No, absolutely not. In fact, my approach to old school role-playing games is a couple of sentences for a spell. As long as I know what it does and how many dice I need to, have the players roll for damage and things like that, that's fine with me. So we've got loads and loads of spells. So as you can see, I'm still flipping through all this, and we are still in the spells section. So we get to page 117, and we get our first discussion of how to play. So this is both player and game master facing. And it basically gives you a breakdown of, okay, so this is the game. This is how you're going to play the game. The core mechanics to OSRIC are relatively simple. Some of them still are a little bit creaky and have been replaced for the better in more modern role-playing games. But we still have that level of detail that a lot of people really loved about AD&D. So it's all still in here. Funny thing, too, is that this how to play section, it's got information about hirelings and henchmen and all these things that probably are not going to come into play all too often. We got our section about like adventuring and exploration. There's even a short example dungeon right here. There you go. The example dungeon and a short example of play. So sample party session. And that runs to page, 140. Well, if we toss that out. So we go, say, page 145. So from 117 to 145, these are the core mechanics of how to play with a lot of stuff on top of it. The rest of this is essentially data for you to use. So we've got our next section is talking about dungeon, towns, and wilderness. So it gives you a lot of the random tables that people would be very, very familiar with from the Dungeon Master's Guide back in the day. In fact, my best friend, Elliot Miller, who I have known for 40 years, when I first met him, like the second day of my freshman year in high school, he was talking about Dungeons and Dragons and how he would actually randomly roll up dungeons from the Dungeon Master's Guide and play them solo. So I had never done that. So we get to the monster section, and almost half of this book is devoted to two things: monsters and treasure. Magic items, And one of the aspects that I always love about any role-playing game is the bestiary, the monster manuals. Always love it. We get into this section, we get a bit more artwork than we've seen throughout the rest of the book, so that's very cool. We do not have artwork for each and every entry here. That's okay. I understand it. Remember, this is a hardcover book you can pick up for $25.20, and the PDF, which is exactly this. It is not a PDF that is art-free or anything like that, is absolutely free. So I have to, give credit that there's a lot more artwork than had to be in this book. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So some of the things that are different from AD&D books to OSRIC, for one, the word count is way lower. You're looking at, there's 3 core books that are squeezed into 379 pages. That said, the writing style is not super dry. It's not like technical writing or anything like that. So I love that fact. Really, really do dig that. I got to be honest, there are people out there who, Gary Gygax's language, as some people refer to it as high Gygaxian, just turns people off. And that is not here. So we have much briefer descriptions. This isn't as verbose as Gygax's books would be. So just kind of showing these off here. Then we get into our treasure. And of course, we have just regular treasure, maps and coins, jewelry. So, of course, once again, we have a bunch of random tables from that. And then we start getting into, magic items and so on and so forth. And that's how we're going to finish up the book, is just with all the different treasure and magic items, artifacts. And then we get some compiled tables for our appendixes, or appendices, as some people refer to them as. And then we also have our player character sheet as well. So we've got that available for you. And then, of course, we've got an index in the back. We got some advertising as well. And that is what we find with OSRIC. This is supposed to be version 2.2, which is the most recent edition, which I think off the top of my head came out in 2013. But I know there's a lot of interest in this book. So that is one of the reasons why I wanted to review it. I wanted to share it with folks with the page through that I did previously as well. So let's swing on over to the other camera, and I'm going to share my final thoughts and give this a review score. Okay, so I've got the first edition books right behind me, even though you don't see the monster manual and deities and demigods and it's not really considered a core book, Fiend Folio. So I've already got those books. But I wanted to pick up OSRIC because I had heard good things about it. Now, keep in mind, this was not sent to me for review. I purchased this book. Not that that changes anything. Those of you who are familiar with the Gaming Gang know it doesn't matter if it's a review copy sent to me or if it's something I've gone out and purchased. You're still going to get the unvarnished, truth out of me. I like OSRIC, but there are some things that I'm not so keen on. As far as just completely replicating AD&D without making any mechanical changes, so some of the oddness, some of the wonkiness of some of the mechanics are still there. That really doesn't bother me. because there are other products out there that kind of address more of a retro clone modernization of first edition Dungeons and Dragons. So I like the fact that this is all the way it's compiled is much more intuitive. You don't need the 3 books. Obviously enough, you're essentially getting Advanced Dungeons and Dragons in one book for $25.20 or as a free PDF. There are some things that are missing, of course, because really OSRIC was put together as a way for publishers to produce first edition adventures without stepping on anybody's copyright. So it does utilize the open game license as well. And that's why you don't see any mention of D&D within the pages of OSRIC. So it doesn't have beholders. There's no displacer beasts. So some of the things that are considered under copyright to Wizards of the Coast aren't present. Something else that's not present, as I mentioned, there were a lot of people out there, even today, who have a hard time with the original books because of that high Gygaxian language. Gary was using his thesaurus, so he expected you to bust yours out too. That said, there's a lot of good advice in the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual that Gary Gygax wrote that's very useful. And I do miss that aspect of D&D being in OSRIC. It's not there. There are tips and things like that, don't get me wrong, but it's not that Gygax information, because Gary was running the game forever and putting it down on paper. So he was telling you kind of how he did it. And I really do like that as well. And of course, as I mentioned, it's missing. So is OSRIC right for you? That's a big question, because I think everybody's mileage is really going to vary with this. Because if you have no interest in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and how we used to play D&D back in the day, I don't see any reason why you would pick this up. It's simply not going to be in your wheelhouse. Yet, if you want to see a crunchier approach to fantasy role-playing games as opposed to what you see nowadays in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, if you want to see kind of the kick down the door, kill the monsters, take their loot approach to things, then I definitely do recommend it. I like the book. I like the book a lot. The big selling point to me is that you're essentially getting the 3 core books from Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which if you wanted to purchase those on the secondary market are going to set you back quite a bit. I do know at Drive-Thru RPG you can get the PDFs of the collector's editions that they released, I don't know, about 12 years ago, 11 years ago, in PDF for about $10 each, or about $30 in print on demand. I got to say, as opposed to going that route, unless you want it for the nostalgia, then definitely OSRIC is going to fit your needs. Once again, I have to point out some of the wonkiness, the weirdness of first edition is still here. It's not been changed. So there are points in the mechanics that people don't like. They are still here. But I do like OSRIC. I think if you're interested in seeing how we used to do it old school in one volume, it's worth picking up. I give this an 8 out of 10. So I do recommend it. I really do like it. And absolutely grab the PDF for free over at lulu.com if you're up in the air on if you think you might like this or not. All right, that is it for this time out. If you like this video, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already. And if you subscribe, ding that bell, because not only will it let you know when I upload videos such as this review, it'll also tell you when my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Monday through Thursday nights right here on YouTube. Of course, when you're not watching videos on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to go to thegaminggang.com for all the latest in gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more. You know the drill. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Once again, I am Jeff McAleer. Thank you so much for taking some time out to check out my review of OSRIC. And as I wrap up all my videos during this never-ending pandemic, I certainly hope all of you out there are being smart and staying safe. Oh, hey, you're still here. Well, if that's the case, by all means, if you haven't subscribed to the Gaming Gang channel yet, click right here. If you'd like to see the latest episode of the Gaming Gang Dispatch, click right up there. And if you want to trust YouTube's algorithm to give you something to watch, click right there. Once again, thanks so much for watching, and everybody please wear a mask.